Welcome to this video lecture on models with the Department of Public Policy, University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. This lecture is intended for POL 500, Introduction to Public Policy and the Policymaking Process. So here is an example of a simple model. On the left you have what's considered a box model. It's often used as a way to show relationships and to consider sort of within a confined set of space and rules how interactions are occurring. So the light blue box, what's identified here is a system component. I've taken this from materials that I've used and developed elsewhere in my environmental policy courses. But this simple box model is conceptually appropriate for any sort of modeling. And what you can see is that you have, again, the box or the system component, anything that you're looking at. This could be, by the way, it doesn't have to be physical, it can be conceptual. It can be a policy, certainly in the case of public policy, that you might be looking at, a legitimated policy, for example, a law, regulation, or these rather undefined associations, what we call often soft power and some other areas. You could be looking at sort of concepts as your component that you're considering. And then to the left, you see in green the inflows, that sort of it could be a number of things, but it's information, energy, actions, activity, something moving into the system component. And then you have outflows, things moving outside of the component. At the bottom you see what's called a feedback loop. And the feedback loop is to provide the notion that these interactions occur. Something might come into the system, interact with the system component, and alter it in some way, make some change, and then as a result of that, you can have different outflows. But those outflows also result in what may be feedbacks, sometimes positive feedbacks, depending on how you're looking at it, sometimes negative feedbacks, how you might define that. But there are these basic components in modeling. And the reason I'm showing this simple box model is because it's to give you the notion or the consideration that modeling is really a way of simplifying the world so that you can try to understand it. And often, of course, when we simplify things, we place limitations on our understanding, meaning that it's less likely that what we're looking at is absolutely true, or maybe said another way, is always true in every circumstance. But we do this so that we can sort of wrap our arms around it, conceptually again, wrap our minds around it maybe is the better term, to think about how these interactions result in and might cause, if we go back to some of the earlier discussion in the previous video on the consequences of policies, how policy changes over time, some of this cause and effect or causal relationships. Why models? Why do we use models in public policy? Well, as I just indicated, one reason is to simplify the world around us. Things are really complicated, right? The world is complicated, and not only the natural world, but the human interactions and our sort of human created portions of the world, institutions that we create. The means by which, in the earlier video, I identified sort of a descriptive understanding of public policy, what governments do. We can sort of look at any given action, and I used the budget. The federal budget was one example that I used. And we can look at what the federal government spends its money on. And that's a very good descriptive way of understanding what government chooses to do or what it is doing. And then, whatever government's not spending its money on is an example of what government is not doing. Once we start thinking about beyond the sort of descriptive, just identifying, for example, what government's spending its money on, we might start asking our questions, more deeper questions, more difficult questions to answer, like why? Why is government spending that much money on that program? Or why is it not spending money on some other program, some other goal, a social goal, or something of that like? Why is government choosing to have a progressive tax policy? Those are all examples provided in the previous video. What models do is models, as we start getting into some of those deeper questions, they help us simplify the world around us to give us a context to try to understand the whys, maybe, some of the whys, and certainly to try to understand some of the consequences. Again, we simplify so that we can sort of wrap our heads, make certain assumptions, and hold on to those assumptions, and then based on those assumptions, we move forward in trying to analyze and understand the sort of cause and effect relationships in public policy. Beyond simplifying the world around us, models also help us focus on what is most important, sort of the root of the problem. Many times there can be a number of variables or factors that influence a particular outcome. But many of those variables and factors, why they might be important, and certainly might be important in the aggregate when you combine them all together, maybe individually or even in the aggregate, they add up to something that's not sort of the tipping point, meaning that, let's say, there's something less than 50% of what matters. Maybe there's one variable that you identify that is significant, that has significant weight, something 51% or more, that really matters. And by modeling, sometimes you can identify what that variable is, and it helps you to focus on that thing that is helping the policy move in a particular direction or has helped cause the policy to be what it is. Right? So modeling helps us in that way because it can allow us to focus on things that are important. And I have here, what is the root of the problem? Knowing the exact problem helps us identify an exact solution. Kind of like a good medical diagnosis. The TV show House was a great program in many ways because it was always sort of Sherlock Holmes in the medical world, right? There was always some, if you had seen any of the episodes or if you watch it on Netflix or any other place, Hulu, wherever it might be available to you, some previous years, you'll see that there's always some sort of strange affliction that somebody has usually. And the sort of premise of the show is that they have to sort of reverse engineer to try to figure out what is the cause, what's causing this malady, what is the root cause. And many times there's multiple symptoms, there's a lot of things to go on, and they try a lot of tests, they do a lot of things to rule out what might be the cause, and trying to simplify. I think that's just conceptually a pretty good example or analogy of exactly what sort of modeling helps us do in public policy. It's kind of like being a sleuth. It's kind of like trying to get to the heart of what is more likely than not to be the problem here, the issue here. In the sort of, not the lecture video, but in the background video that I provide in the Module 2, you get to get a good overview of some of the models that are being used in public policy and how they're used and why we come to use them, conceptually how they help us think about problems. And often models are valuable because they do that. They help us think about problems in a certain way. A punctuated equilibrium, there's a reading specifically on punctuated equilibrium. And that's a relatively new theory as applied to public policy, borrowed from the hard sciences or natural sciences maybe, but a way of thinking about how evolution has occurred. Over time, punctuated equilibrium theory is a very important theory to help explain sort of the mass extinctions that we've had over time throughout our geologic history here on Earth. Well, that theory is now being applied to some of the problems that we experience in our world, some human-caused or human-related problems, and what might be some of the cause and effects, and potentially some of the solutions. And what the theory does is it helps to provide a framework, a way of thinking about the problem. It is, in many ways, a model, punctuated equilibrium theory, a way of sort of constructing the problem, like our box model that I showed in the previous slide. And so it's, again, another example of why models can be important, because they help us simplify and think about the issue in a particular kind of context. What models don't do. Models don't make moral judgments. So, and usually they don't. I mean, depending on the inputs or the outputs that you identify, the factors that you identify, you can make moral judgments, right? If you're using the model in a way that you're putting information in a certain way that identifies moral judgments, then you can have, sort of a moral aspect to your analysis. And we talked about earlier in terms of the first materials on public policy that you can come to policy from an advocacy standpoint. And certainly from an advocacy standpoint, you are generally making normative judgments, right? You think something is better than something else. Generally, the models themselves tend to be amoral, right? They tend not to give you a sort of, this is better than that, in the sense of better being defined by, it's more liberal or it's more conservative, and that then means better. It saves money, and that means it's better. So models by themselves are sort of amoral in that way. So they don't really help us identify what might be the best solution. And they also don't tell us how to determine the best choice. They don't necessarily help us say, well, since things have been going along this way, it's very simple to identify. The model helps us understand, oh, historically things have occurred this way, and it's very likely that something has been a significant factor in driving the policy in a certain direction. The model might help you identify that significant factor, that root cause, that 51 or more %. But it doesn't necessarily identify what to do as a result of that, or should you make a change? Should you change your choice or your direction? There was, as an example, in the first video lecture, there was the National Flood Insurance Program, and the public flood insurance program here in the United States was identified as an existing policy. And there was a quick history of that, of the evolution of that policy was given as a way of trying to understand why the government might be supplying subsidized, right, not market rate, but subsidized flood insurance, because charging some money is better than charging no money, right? And we understand that context, and the context was, well, if the government wasn't forcing people to buy some flood insurance, it was still protecting, giving a de facto flood insurance policy through federal disaster relief. And because of that, something's better than nothing. Now that's context for us. So we say, oh, well, within that context, that microcosm of decision making, it might make sense because the government's getting some money when before they were getting nothing. So I can understand that. I can understand that that makes some sense. But that history doesn't necessarily tell us much about where we are today, meaning that, as that example argued, that there's a pretty strong disconnect between how people perceive the risks of flooding, particularly in coastal areas in the United States, based on how much they pay for flood insurance and what that actual risk really is. There's a pretty strong disconnect. And so if we looked only at that disconnect, I mean, the model might tell us that, the significant variable here, the significant factor, is the price paid for flood insurance. And if we took that as being the most important thing, then that's important. We know that, boy, flood insurance costs really matter in how people perceive risk, at least in terms of flooding, and particularly in coastal areas. And if all of that's true, if the model helps to identify that as true, the question is, what do we do about that? What choice do we make? Do we change? I mean, maybe there was an argument put forward that maybe people should be paying more market rate. But that's very difficult. And there's all kinds of cascading effects that can result from that. Property tax valuations, assessments, the way in which local communities fund education through property taxes. There's just a myriad of issues that arise, because if you did that, it's very likely that it would have an effect on the real estate value of coastal properties. And that's just one example. So models don't help us understand that. They don't tell us consequence in that way. So they don't necessarily tell us, well, how do we deal with this? But like a computer, they are simple. They are simply a tool to help us make a choice. We still have to be smart enough to make a good choice. In other words, models can give us options, alternatives, that sort of thing. But then we have to decipher what is the best or optimal choice in the circumstances. And by the way, there are models, probabilistic models, policy analysis models, many different ways to help us make that decision. Many of them borrowed from economics. Cost-benefit analysis is one strong example that you get into and will get into under policy analysis at the end of this course, and then extend it in other courses in the MPP program. So models don't do a lot of things. They do some powerful things, they're simplified, but there's a lot that they don't do. Most importantly, they don't really help us tell us exactly what we should do. The types of models, well, as noted in the book, in the materials provided, there's a bunch. It depends on certain assumptions, what you are trying to accomplish. What I mean there is that there are more and more models that are being developed. Punctuated equilibrium theory, for example, is a newer model that I've identified. But here are some of the sort of foundational, traditional models that are used in public policy, trying to understand policy, understand how it works. Institutionalism is fundamental, and institutionalism focuses on the institutions. And we've talked about the institutions. I used the hierarchy of laws in the previous video lecture as an example. And that's where the branches of government are focused upon. Here in the United States, the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, separation of powers, and how that presents all kinds of sort of relational issues. So institutionalism really focuses on government as separate branches and the power structures that exist between them, those checks and balances. and how that moves forward the formulation of policy, policy through legislation, for example, and some of those other things. And then you have policy as a process, and this looks not so much at the institutions, for example, but at the process itself. How is policy moving from an idea, a concept, an agenda, right, through a process? And we'll actually talk about the foundational or policy-making process as one example in the materials. So the whole process from beginning an idea of policy, a concept, all the way through evaluation of that policy, and potentially if the evaluation, again, depending on a number of factors, might change. You might engage in policy change as a final thing. There's also rationalism, so you can borrow from psychology and from philosophy, for example, sort of like maximizing social gain, sort of utilitarianistic characteristic to it. There's incrementalism, which is the sort of idea that policies, once in place at least, they move very slow and steady. So there's incremental changes made to policies over a long period of time. And if you're using that, just imagine using that context, you would say, well, okay, so I can see the tax law, for example, right? The Internal Revenue Code. It's been in existence for a long time. It's probably not going to go away anytime soon. And the ideas for this big change to this very complicated law is probably unlikely. And the fact that it's really complicated, just that fact, just the descriptive fact that if you look at the Internal Revenue Code, you see all of these exceptions, all of these, it's really, really long. It has all of these sort of small little changes to it over a long period of time. That probably gives you some support for incrementalism, or at least you can look at it through the context of incrementalism and it makes more sense to you. Because you can say, yes, there's this big body, and then there's been these small additions over periods of time. I often use the Frankenstein theory, right? It's this, you're adding these parts to this thing, and it's made up of different kinds of parts, but those parts help in the whole to create the being, the entity, the policy, but it's a sum of its parts. And so incrementalism is very much along those lines, where it's this sort of slow, progressive process. Group theories, another way to think about policy. Public policy, and groups control movements. So you look at groups, special interests, for example, right? Elite theory looks at subgroups, specifically special groups, elites. And again, so corporations, for example, through lobbying efforts can control the ear of government, and particularly the Congress or the legislature. So this folds back elite theory into institutionalism a little bit because, right? Institutionalism then starts with the foundations that, for example, you create policy through legislation, through lawmaking. Well, who's controlling, what gets on the agenda of the lawmaking folks, right? Is it are the elected officials really looking to their constituencies, or are they looking to special interests through lobbying efforts, that sort of thing? There's public choice theory, which talks about a lot about market forces, looks at some of the economic aspects of how policy is made, again, how markets, can engender and force change over periods of time. We see this a lot. We had our economic crisis here in 2008 in the United States and globally, but we can see that banks, and there was some identification of a few institutions that were working, private institutions or quasi-private institutions that were working in such a way that were deregulated, and as a result of that, they had some perverse incentives, and they did some things that increased the amount of risk. And ultimately, the government decided to act as a backstop for that risk and bail out the banks, those sort of things. So public choice theory might look at that and say, well, reform, policy reform comes about through these kinds of situations where market forces will push incentives in one direction, so then government needs to intervene. A lot of environmental policy really focuses on government intervention because of the foundations of market failures. You think of environmental harm as a market failure, and that's sort of the foundation for public choice theory as applied to environmental issues. There's also game theory. Game theory focuses on competition, the idea of competition as opposed to cooperation, for example, between two different entities, and how that competition then results in, the formation of incentives. And there are some famous ones. There's the prisoner's dilemma, if you've ever heard of that. That's a famous example of a competitive environment game theory, which helps you understand likelihoods of certain events occurring. and it can be very powerful. Game theory is often used in defense or military strategy, so policies related to defense, public policies, often derive themselves using sort of competitive game theory. There's others. It's used in finance and many areas of business. Game theory, particularly, one of the ways that you look at it, again, thinking from that box model as an example, what are the rules, right? What are the rules? This is how you simplify the world. There's only certain rules that apply, right? What is the goal? What is the best strategy? The Prisoner's Dilemma, and I won't get into details. You can look it up. There's great videos on the Prisoner's Dilemma as an example, but there's very defined rules. And there's really one of the important rules in the Prisoner's Dilemma is the lack of sharing of information. The two individuals cannot talk to each other, so they cannot come to some sort of cooperative opportunity. And because then it's a question of how much do they trust the other individual. And under sort of the optimal strategy, if we think of, and this gets into some other areas of economics, but what is the optimal strategy for each player? And their optimal strategy is basically to tell on each other. That's what it comes down to in terms of the way the rewards are structured, so the goals, the rewards. The point is, when you think of game theory and the Prisoner's Dilemma as an example, there's very specific defined rules. This is a really good example of how models really simplify the world in ways that just aren't necessarily accurate. As a counterexample to game theory, to Prisoner's Dilemma, the Stag Hunt is a cooperative game, and it simply changes the rule by the fact that the two people can share information with each other, and it really changes the incentives. So if you think about sharing information, and what that tells you, by the way, just using, again, game theory, particularly the Prisoner's Dilemma and Stag Hunt, is that when you look at these very simple rules, but you change one factor, which is cooperation versus the inability to cooperate, what you end up seeing, as long as the incentives are relatively the same, that cooperation can really change the dynamics. Now that's an important lesson in policy, right? So you would think maybe, and this has been used many times, in the rulemaking process in environmental issues, negotiated rulemaking has become, over the past few decades, relatively popular, where all parties who have a vested interest in a particular rule, say, a new amendment to the Clean Air Act or a new rule implementing the Clean Air Act, and that's going to regulate stationary sources of pollution. Getting these companies, these industries, sitting at the table and using a cooperative environment vis-a-vis the Stag Hunt has been shown ultimately to be much more cost-effective and result in greater satisfaction amongst the groups. Instead of the government just going about through EPA, for example, its traditional sort of like formal rulemaking process and using a negotiated, mediated sort of session where everybody's sitting at the table sharing ideas, cooperating, as opposed to more of a competitive environment, like a trial-like environment. It's been shown to be quite powerful. And so there's one simple example of how how modeling can help you, in game theory specifically, gain some certain insights. And in this case, the Stag theory helps us sort of modify the Prisoner's Dilemma by seeing cooperation as a powerful force. Rock, paper, scissors I have here as a silly example, but this is a very simple game most of us know, and I know there's all kinds of new variations on it, additional things. But this is another very simple, if you think about it, it's just trying to bring home the point of rules and how the rules get simplified in models, and we can then use those rules as ways to see behavior patterns, right? And you can learn. There's a whole set of learning dynamics about how people sort of take previous interactions and how they update their information using previous interactions to think about the world slightly differently. Now this matters because if you're thinking about policy, for example, if we go back to the public flood insurance, if we assume that we can convince people over a period of time to become more capable of ingesting, internalizing risk through the amount they pay for flood insurance, but we can't do it all at once, then maybe we learn from that the way to solve the flood insurance issue is over a relatively not too long period of time, but we incrementally increase the amount of risk they're internalizing. So say the government's subsidizing 80% of the actual risk in the price that is paid for flood insurance right now. Maybe we learned that we move from 80 to 70 to 60 to 50 to 40 to 30 to 20 over subsequent years. So we're slowly over time habituating those coastal dwellers to higher, but not sticker shock higher in any given year, but slightly higher premiums over a longer period of time. And that is the way in which the policy should be implemented. We could actually do that through using, for example, like a rock, paper, scissors or some other game to help us understand, again, behaviorally, how people are more accepting of policy change, of changes, how they come to accept changes over long periods of time by updating their worldviews, their heuristics, the way they see the world. So how does this help? Well, it helps to explain the why and the consequences. If policy is the what, the why, and the consequences, then models really helps us understand the why and the consequences. It does not really help with explaining the what, which is the thing we observe, like what is government spending this year, right? What is the federal government spending out of its budget? That we can observe. Games don't really help us understand that. Or I'm sorry, models. Models help us understand why is government spending more on this year than last year, or why is the proportion between social welfare and defense a certain amount, or why isn't government doing more in terms of discretionary spending because maybe they don't have enough, right? That sort of thing. But models help us understand the whys and then the consequences. An example is, why is Iran trying to enrich uranium? Why are they? Iran says it's because they want to increase, right, their own production of energy, right? So they want to provide electricity and energy to their country, and that's why they're doing it. So for peaceful means. And of course, there's a suspicion by some other countries that no, that is not why you're doing it. You're doing it because you want to have weapons-grade uranium. You want to have nuclear power in that way and use it in a sort of sword and shield scenario, but for defense and for maybe offensive reasons. And those are two very different goals, right? And so we wonder, how can models help us try to understand what is the likely answer? Is it more likely it's one or the other? Is it a mix of the two, right? Models can maybe help us simplify that question to get us closer to the why. Another example is, what are the consequences of rising student loan debt for our future economy, right? This is for many of you, for most of us, that's something that we can all consider, is that, we can look at the notion of debt in general, but models can help us identify the special relationship in terms of price differentials, in terms of income differentials, what percentage of the average, graduating student's income is being put towards student loan debt servicing, and then what's left over, and how does that compare, and then over time. There's a number of ways that we can look at that question to try to determine, and that, by the way, was an economic analysis, right? So that would fall more into sort of like public choice theory, but with a little variant on that. There's a number of ways we can use these models to help us answer these interesting questions. So that's a summary of the model section. I hope it makes sense to you, and we'll just continue with the materials, and I look forward to our future video lectures.